Hello and welcome to In Conversation with WLV Doctoral College. I'm Dr Deborah Cureton and I'm the Research Development Manager at the University of Wolverhampton.
Well, I'm Dr Ben Halligan, I'm Director of the Doctoral College.
We are doing a series of vlogs about the various chapters of your thesis. So today's vlog we're going to talk about the literature review chapter. So for me this is an interesting chapter because for some theses that might be one chapter, for some it might be two, or it might be one chapter split into two main parts, particularly in the field that I work in where there's often the bringing together of two different discipline areas. And how people manage that is really interesting. There's no right or wrong way of doing it. And in another blog we talk about the introduction to a thesis. So I always say to my students, it really doesn't matter how you approach it, as long as you can justify it in the introduction and tell your reader what you've done and why you've done it. So there are usually some main bits of a literature review that you would need to cover. So Ben, for you, what's really important to be in the literature review?
Well, often it's the first thing that you write. And I think in the first year, if you're full-time of doctoral research, you will be engaged with scoping the field, finding out what's already out there, and then putting it into a literature review. So at the end of the literature review, you should have really an acknowledgement of all the work that's relevant to your particular research and what's been done and things like that. I would split it in a couple of ways.
Yeah.
I think you need to work out what the primary reading is and the secondary reading. So I think that while you may come across a mass of stuff, some of which may not even be particularly academic, it may be journalistic,
Yeah.
I would perhaps stick that in a kind of secondary reading category and deal with it fairly quickly. But you will find stuff eventually that is perhaps very close to your approach or the themes that your thesis is looking at or the subject matter. And these therefore are the forerunners of your research. These are the people whose work you may build on, that you may revise, that you may feel inspired by, that you may feel is problematic and needs to be rethought and reworked. So this would be the primary reading. Another way of splitting that would be, I guess, around the good guys and the bad guys, to be specific about those sources that you think are very useful to you and have exerted a positive influence, and that maybe you want to take their ideas and extend them, or pick up where they left off and see if what they argued was still true. So, when people say what's the approach of your thesis, and the response might be I'm drawing on the work of X. X would be one of the good guys.
Mm-hmm.
But conversely, I think you need a few kind of enemies, whipping boys, bad guys as well. So people, the work which really has fallen short and that your work seeks to correct. So that you're saying, I will not, in the literature review, having looked at these articles, these books, I find that they've fallen short. Maybe they've damaged the evolution of the discipline. Maybe there are oversights that are deeply problematic. Maybe this has resulted in a very partial or limited series of outcomes that we now need to question. So these are the examples that you don't aspire to. You're going to avoid the mistakes that you find in this section of the literature. And that's terribly important as well. I want to be like this research, I don't want to be like this research. So in short, splitting it into primary and secondary sources, and splitting it into those that are working for you and those that aren't working for you.
So I suppose in other discipline areas that might be things like what's written in academic peer review, what's the grey literature. That might also be around what's policy document, what's experimental, what's qualitative, yes, I should say, pieces of work. I think in all doctorates it tends to be a bit of a funnel. You start talking about the wider area, the wider research in the area, and you kind of funnel it down till you get to the point where you're talking about the specifics of your particular thesis. And through that wider literature, through the synthesis and that critique of the literature that you were talking about, you come to form what we call a theoretical framework. So that's a number of studies that you synthesise, a number of arguments that you synthesise that underpin the research that you are doing, how you're doing it and why you're doing it, and that kind of highlights what's been done in the area, but also where there are gaps in the area that you're going to fill.
I mean, this sounds quite abstract, but it occurs to me that there's a very straightforward sports analogy that might shed some light on this. If your team is preparing to play another team, it would be quite normal to watch old matches that the other team have played in, and to work out their techniques and what's worked for them. So you have to work out how to deal with it or avoid it, and what the weaknesses are, what didn't work. So you have to work out how to maybe take advantage of those and do something, And what we're talking about is essentially really just that, isn't it? To look at the techniques that are already out there in the field and then work out our relationship to them.
For some discipline areas as well, there's a methodological aspect in the literature review. So some discipline areas will ask you about how you've interrogated the data, how you've searched the data, how you've analysed the data, and what themes have arisen through that data. So there might be a section in your literature review that covers that. It might only be a paragraph, but certainly I know in education, and particularly in health and wellbeing, examiners do look for that to make sure that it's systematic or a thorough literature review that isn't biased. And I think that's the thing, you have to present work in a way that's unbiased so that you can argue your research is needed.
I mean, in, let's say, more social sciences, sociological research, it may be that the literature review has to establish the frequency of the use of a certain term in European newspapers or whatever. So they will say, we use this program, we use this archive, we found it occurred X thousand times between this year and that year. So they will actually be really quite precise. And that literature review can begin to result in graphs, data, pie charts, things like that.
We wouldn't expect to see pie charts, data in education, health, wellbeing, psychology, but what we would expect to see is search terms, the databases, the years that you've been searching for literature, inclusion and exclusion criteria, also the methods that you use to search the literature. So did you do a systematic review of the literature, or did you do a systematic review and snowballing? So there are different methodological types that you might want to go away and read about and look at. And then again, how you analyse that data, and there are different methods of analysis. You'd expect a discussion about those terms, but not necessarily graphs and anything pictorial in the way that your field would do.
I mean, this question of years is important as well, because I think a lot of doctoral researchers live in fear that a big article or book will be published that's directly relevant to what they're doing, 2 weeks before they're submitting and things like that. I mean, my answer is that it won't be so directly relevant, because usually what you're doing is quite unique to yourself.
Yeah.
But it's a very good idea to, before you submit, just do one final quick scope. Is there anything that's come out in the last couple of months? Because you don't want the examiners to say, you know what, I was just reading an article or a book about this that was published 4 months ago, and you say, oh, what was that? You're meant to be with an advanced knowledge of your area, so you're meant to know all of this stuff. So you can wax up in at the last minute.
So your literature review might be the first thing you write, but it's always one of the last things you write as well.
Yes.
I think what's interesting is going back to that concept, that fear that you're going to come across a piece of work that is exactly the same, that's answered the question. I always say to students, like you say, that actually they might ask something similar, but they're not going to be doing it in the same way. So if I give you an example from my PhD, I was looking at the cognitive overlap between two conditions, being unassertive and being depressed. Now, whilst I was doing my research, when I did the literature review, I came across a paper that looked at those factors in a Chinese population. But what that wasn't doing was looking at those factors in a European population, in a British population. So there were similarities and differences, but what it did was provide me with a framework, a foundation, something to build on, to say that this work has been done in this area, and this is what was found, but there are differences in these populations. So it kind of gives you something to work off, a springboard, if you like, to take your work on from. So actually, when those fears really should be turned into opportunities, and they're not going to be doing the work that you are doing through the lens that you are doing it, in the way that you are doing it. Actually, what they're providing you with is some validation of what you're doing is really important.
Absolutely true. So similar studies can be used to validate what you're doing. These studies have been peer reviewed and published, but no one's quite done it in the way I'm doing it. So okay. I mean, the other question I get is the researcher will say, do you know what, there is no literature in my area.
Yeah. So
what am I going to write my literature review on? Do I need it? Maybe I can just skip over that bit. But to me that's also quite useful, because if there genuinely is nothing that's been written on this phenomena that you're wanting to look at, then that raises a series of questions. And I would rather that they interrogate other sources that you would have expected to have considered this particular thing and that haven't, and therefore how these other studies have been damaged by their failure to consider that particular thing. So that in itself, that absence, is actually really worthy of a lot of discussion. I mean, it does raise, I guess, another element of the literature review, and you talked about a kind of grey area.
The grey literature.
And I talked about kind of journalism maybe is relevant. And I suppose as well you have a lot of blogs flying around and things like that. But I think that to an extent you have to be quite careful in the literature review that you're engaging with your primary sources, or those that are exerting influence over your work, that are actually properly academic. That is, academic presses, fully peer reviewed, that they actually can bear the weight, they can be the foundation of what it is that you're building.
For me, the grey literature might be reports. So there are pieces of research that are done, that are funded, and those funding reports. They might be reports that are written about the area I research in is academic attainment and equality issues pertaining to that. So there are lots of reports that are written by quite learned organisations, but they're not necessarily published in peer-reviewed journals. There's a lot of really good work that's gone into those journals, so that gone into those reports. So that's what I call the grey literature.
I think, it can be a weakness throughout the PhD if the criticism you're making of other existing literature, if that literature is not solidly academic. So I think there needs to be really an assembly of the key sources that are from more traditional academic grounds to bring in additional stuff, journalism, reports, blogs. And I think it's kind of fine in a supplementary manner. Perhaps a bit later on. The literature review, I was thinking about the size of it, and I think that's often really quite disciplinary dependent. I mean, in some areas of the arts, it wouldn't be unusual to have 10, 12, 13,000 words, where you're engaging with a lot of literature that's already been written, but you really have to map it all out. I mean that's perhaps the maximum length, but not so unusual.
But then when you look at the size of a PhD in that area, so a PhD in that area would be 80 or 90,000 words, or a professional doctorate would be 40,000 words. Whereas when you look at the sciences would have a 45,000 word. At Wolverhampton it's 45,000 words, and a professional doctorate is science professional doctorate is 25,000 words. So yeah, I think the literature review has several functions. One is introducing the work that's been done in the area, introducing what's already been said and the strengths and weaknesses of that, but also introducing where there's a gap in the knowledge that you're going to fill. I think that we talked about this theoretical framework, that's a synthesis of the work that's out there and what it's telling us, and that really needs to be what underpins the research questions that we ask. So the literature review has a function for providing a springboard into the research that you're going to do, the research questions you're going to ask, why you're going to ask them, what word, how that's going to be worded, how that's going to be structured.
I mean, it can be quite boring to write, because a literature review can be quite pedestrian.
Yeah.
If you've got 5 books that are on your particular subject matter, to an extent there is a need just to go trot through them one after the other. And then the author turns to this, and then there's some data where they look at this, so that they're able to argue that. And, I mean, there can be, I would like to think when you're writing in art social sciences, you're doing with a bit of panache, a bit of pizzazz, and I think you're maybe in a slightly kind of lower gear when you're writing a literature review.
But I think you up that gear in that you don't describe the books, you lead the arguments with your voice, in whether you're writing in the first or the third person. You should be leading that argument and using the work of others as citations to underpin, back up and support what you're saying.
I mean, often I think with a new PhD student, the first year, if they're full-time, will be spent doing the first draft of the introduction, the literature review, and then perhaps most of the methodology. So that if at the end of that first year they're fully aware of the existing literature, that with the literature review they've got a sense of the justification of what they're doing with the introduction, and then with the methodology they have a almost complete idea of how they're going to do it. That's a very solid first year of work, and in fact the basis therefore to begin the field work or looking at the key examples and actually write the very middle body of the PhD.
Okay. So tips when writing the literature review?
I think that you need to be as inclusive as possible, but I would split the literature into primary and secondary, and I would split the literature into the stuff that's inspiring you and the stuff that you're seeking to avoid. Okay.
And for me, I'm going to be very practical. Keep sending the drafts of what you're writing to your supervisors, because through the writing of your literature review, you're starting to develop your academic voice. Your supervisors will be able to give you feedback in the early parts of your thesis about the development of that academic voice, helping you and encouraging you to take the lead and to be the lead author of your thesis. So the literature review has a number of functions in setting up the research, but also has a function in helping you develop your voice as a writer. Okay, so thank you for listening. As always, if you like our vlogs, please do follow us, follow our channel. You can click the button to get notifications for when we release new vlogs. We release new vlogs every Friday. And if you've got any ideas for vlogs that you would like us to do, any topics or anything that you would like us to cover, please put it into the comments below. We love to hear from you, and we're more than happy to cover the things that you want us to cover. So thanks for listening, and we'll speak to you again soon. Bye.
Bye.